You can't have democracy if you don't have reliable information. You need good information to have good democracy. Even if the water tastes good and is healthy for you, because that's not the point. It's not the flow of the water, it's the pipeline. It's where it's coming from that matters. And it's the same thing with information.
Vladni podcast GOVSI.
Spoštovani poslušalci, poslušalke, dobrodošli v novem podkastu in novi epizodi podcasta GOVSI, kjer danes gostimo pomembnega, uglednega profesorja iz Združenih držav Amerike, Michaela Epsteina. I spell it correct? Epstein?
Yes.
GOVSI, v podcastu GOVSI smo posvetili dezinformacijam veliko časa, pozornosti in med drugim smo zagnali tudi akcijo Preveri, premisli, preveri. Sodeč po izkušnjah v nekaterih evropskih državah pred parlamentarnimi volitvami je ta tema v Sloveniji še toliko bolj aktualna. Zato bomo v tokratnem podcastu skušali svetliti vpliv dezinformacij na volitve v demokratični družbi in pogledati, kako lahko državljani, institucije in tehnološka podjetja v državah pred parlamentarnimi volitvami delujejo odgovorno. Pogovor bo potekal v angleščini, zato bom nadaljeval v tem jeziku. Michael, welcome to podcast GOVSI. It's great to have you with us. To start off, could you briefly introduce yourself and share a bit about your work in the field of media, law, disinformation, please?
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Zoran. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And so, yes, I'm a professor of law at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. I'm the longtime editor of the Journal of International Media and Entertainment Law, which is a faculty-led journal that Southwestern Law School produces in cooperation with the American Bar Association. I am also the director of the Entertainment and Media Law concentration at Southwestern Law School. I have been working for decades in the area of the media law and the First Amendment in the United States, speech rights in the United States, and I've done also a good deal of work in recent years writing and working on projects relating to the fight against disinformation and misinformation around the world, including within the last 5 years, taking on 2 Fulbright specialist projects having to do with the fight against disinformation, one in Africa and another one just this past summer, in the summer of 2025, here in Slovenia.
And your experience in Slovenia?
I very much love this country. It's beautiful. I was smitten even before my plane landed this past summer, just by looking at the Alpine mountains and the greenery. I'm from Los Angeles, so it's a very different type of climate and a very different type of countryside than Slovenia. And I was very much taken with just how lovely people have been here. I did get a big laugh when I did see that you cannot spell Slovenia without L-O-V-E, so without love. It's a catchy slogan, but I did feel a great deal of love here in Slovenia. So thank you for asking.
Good to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, back to the business.
Yes.
Disinformation has become a constant part of our digital environment, everyday life. How would you define disinformation, and why is it such a major challenge? Well, especially when it comes to, elections.
I'll tell you, Zoran, it's such a major challenge because it's often extremely hard to define disinformation, or at least to get a consensus as to what disinformation is.
What is lie? What is disinformation?
Right. So
we have a lot of expressions.
Correct. What is, as you would say, what is a lie, or what is even truth? So truth? I have, I clearly have strong views as to what is truth and what is true. But I also acknowledge that what I think is true, someone else may debate and may not think is true. And disinformation complicates that whole discussion about what is true, because it often means creating and fabricating fake evidence in support of something that is not true. And so it becomes difficult to debate and discuss truth and accuracy in society when you lose the reference points of authenticity, of authenticated evidence. And this is something that scholars refer to as information disorder. It's when you and I, not only we don't disagree, do we not agree about something, but we bring our own evidence in support of what our positions are. And it's not clear if that evidence is authentic or not. And in the age of digital reproduction and artificial intelligence, that's becoming increasingly difficult for us to discern the authenticity of evidence.
The authenticity is one thing, and intentions are maybe...
so the intentionality...
Intentionality
right.
To discuss about that. Who is doing what, in what reason?
Right. I think that's correct. I think that's the distinction, Zoran, between disinformation and, in some ways, its more insidious cousin, misinformation. So disinformation, and it requires deliberation. It requires intentionality. The idea here is to deceive, right? To basically put out false information, presumably so that people will think it's true. And misinformation is what happens to disinformation down the food chain, so to speak, as people consume the information. So the initial disseminators may intend it to deceive, but it's others who are deceived and then pass on the misinformation, thinking it's true, that becomes a real problem because it can expand exponentially online.
It's not wrong to be wrong. We are wrong every day in our life. We don't know everything, and we can spread misinformation because we don't know something.
Right. Well, it's not a question of right or wrong. It's really a question of influence. And I think, you asked to what end? Why do people do disinformation? And there are many reasons. I found in one of my Fulbright projects that some citizens engage in disinformation principally because it's entertaining to them. They enjoy creating a deep fake video or a deep fake photo, or creating a false narrative and then sending it to friends. The problem, though, is even though that's disinformative, it's really not done to deceive. It's done intentionally by the initial disseminator, the person who may have even created the image or the narrative. But as it gets forwarded along to subsequent users of social media, the original context, the joke, the parody, for example, becomes lost. And then people, at least some people, may begin to believe that it's true or it's being positioned as accurate.
Yes. At the Digital Citizenship Conference, you highlighted the concept of information sovereignty, describing it as a content-neutral approach to countering foreign disinformation campaigns. Could you briefly explain what is that?
So,
what's your
yes. So, what am I trying to bring to the table that's not already set? I look at the fight against disinformation as a very important battle. I think it's essential.
For whom?
For society.
For
For democracy. Yes, you took the word out of my mouth. For democracy. Because you can't have democracy if you don't have reliable information. You need good information to have good democracy. The problem with fighting disinformation is that it often can entail censorship. And I find that problematic as a free speech advocate, but I also find it pragmatically challenging because governments and other stakeholders may be reluctant to enter into the let's fight disinformation arena because they don't want to be labeled, they don't want to be tarred as censors. They don't want to be seen as apologists for one political worldview. We've already said the issue of truth and the issue of accuracy are contested today, especially in a divided nation. So what I'm proposing is a way around that by looking at not the content of a message, but the fact that the message is coming from outside the country. So in Europe, there is a great deal of excellent work that's been done on something referred to as foreign information manipulation and interference, known as FIMI, right? And I'm sure you've heard about it.
Yes.
Yes. And
But
information sovereignty is about that F. It's about the foreign aspect, and it's much less about the information aspect. So at that digital conference, I really talked about how I prefer to call it FIM. For foreign interference and manipulation.
Where's the difference? The small kind of question. I heard your presentation and I said, where's the difference?
The difference is, I'm not looking at the content. I'm not suggesting that those who are looking to detect FIMI give a pronouncement about whether something is accurate or whether something is truthful. That's not part of my approach. My approach is, irrespective of the truth or falsity of the underlying message, my focus is on the false designation of origin. What's disinformative about the foreign interference is the fact that it's coming in under false pretenses. Typically, it's a faked social media account, but it's part of an architecture of foreign influence and manipulation that the European Union has done a great deal of excellent research on. It's coming from a foreign source. And that's why to answer your earlier question, that's why I've constructed the term information sovereignty, because no matter what your political worldview might be, you care about the sovereignty of your nation. I think most people in Slovenia, if I asked people assembled at a meeting who here sees Slovenia as a country, they're going to raise their hand. Yes, I see it as a country. They care about sovereignty. And so I am trying to basically look at this as a matter of information sovereignty. You should be able to control, as a country, the information that is coming into that sovereign information space, if you will, under false pretenses from a foreign entity.
Yes, and that topic is connected with, who is the source. We are talking about sources and who is producer. And that point we are talking about professionals who are dealing with
Yep, they have some very fanciful names.
Yes.
The EU External Service has done some great work in this area. We know the architecture of these FIMI campaigns, but still a lot of the effort is on making a pronouncement of accuracy or false, about assessing the message. And that turns off a lot of people, especially in a divided country. I'm trying to remedy that by, I guess you could say, approaching this with a lower common denominator, essentially sovereignty, because that's something that everyone should be able to agree upon, right? Whether it's good information or bad information. I use the analogy of water, and if people in Slovenia are told that this is Slovenian water from a Slovenian source that you are drinking, but it turns out that that's not true, that it's actually a surreptitiously being piped into Slovenia from a neighboring country, Slovenians should know about that. It's a false designation of origin. It says it's Slovenian, but it's not. Even if the water tastes good and is healthy for you, because that's not the point. It's not the flow of the water. It's the pipeline. It's where it's coming from that matters. And it's the same thing with information. You could say something about a political candidate in Slovenia that's perfectly true, that's accurate. You could talk up a candidate's stellar war record. But if you're a foreign entity here under false pretenses with a fake account, and you are pushing that information over and over again onto the Slovenian people, Slovenians should know about that. Why is there this campaign to push this particular candidate? There may be a larger context that could be relevant and interesting to the Slovenian people.
And where are the journalists, media, mainstream media in that context? Sovereignty, they have the role in that?
The mainstream media still have the role that they've always aspired to have. And of course, I don't need to tell you this, Zoran, but there's a spectrum of approaches and viewpoints that may be brought to bear by the mainstream media. But fundamentally, their role would be the same. They are, I would like to think they're here to try to inform their citizens as best they can, that they see that they have a duty to try to get things right, even if they don't always get things right. I think that they clearly could and should have a role to keep government accountable. The so-called watchdog approach to government, that's all still there. But mainstream media doesn't control the flow of information in 2025 or beyond. At this point, the flow of information is on the internet.
We have influencers. We have in TikTok.
Correct. You have social media.
Citizen journalism. Everybody is a journalist.
But that's the question. Is everybody really a journalist? And that's a different question, what the proper role of media is. In the United States, we don't even attempt to define what a journalist is. And in some countries in Europe, they do. But the reality is, whether you do or you don't, everybody is potentially a creator and distributor of content. And that's not how it was in the 20th century. But everybody is now. And because of that, we need to understand that that it's not a question of controlling the dissemination of information. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, if you will. Okay? But what you can do is try to basically look at sources and methods. You can try to use forensic analysis so that you can better identify those influencers, as you describe them, who are essentially state-adjacent actors, often malign actors, who are trying to manipulate the information space in a country.
I'm thinking about analogy. You are describing the idea of sovereign information sovereignty. For me, it's like I'm going to to the shop and I'm buying, some meat. I'm checking the label. This meat was produced in Slovenia, and I will buy it. I don't want meat from, Russia. I don't like it. It's analogy. It's like that.
It's a very good analogy. I use the water one, but you could use all sorts of consumer false designation cases. It could be meat, it could be wine, it could be any number of informative signals to the population as to where something is coming from. And just to be clear, it could also be that you might really like Russian meat, all right? Or you may decide that, this information, it's not actually a homegrown Slovenian activist. It's really a troll farm in the far east of Europe that is behind this. Okay, well, that's fine. You can do that. I'm not telling people what to think here. I'm trying to give people better tools so they can make a better evaluation as to, is this information part of a manipulation campaign? Or is it something that is truly a Slovenian activist who's trying to raise points within the ecosystem, if you will, of the Slovenian information space?
Do we have a recipe how to increase the awareness of consumers, information and consumers, what kind of tools they can use, especially before the elections?
Well, before the elections, of course, I think the best advice I could give before the election would be just be an educated consumer. Where's your information coming from? Who's saying it? Is it an account that you can verify? Is it an account that you've seen and trust? Is it coming from a social media account you've never heard of before that looks like it's coming from one place but really is coming from another? You can do those types of basic interrogations, if you will. But I think that's part of the media information literacy that could be applied just now, at this point, in the immediate run-up to the 2026 election. I would say more generally, I think there's a great opportunity for more media information literacy in the national curriculum reform that I've had a chance to review here in Slovenia. Yes. And I would very much think it would be of value to incorporate this information sovereignty approach into the type of curriculum that is designed to make young people here in Slovenia better and more informed citizens.
Yes. Can we talk about a little bit about media platforms as a massive influence on how information spreads? How do you assess the responsibility of big tech companies, maybe in the field of spreading disinformation?
Well, I mean, that can depend on where, of course, those giant platforms are operating. Of course, in the United States, we really virtually have no guardrails in place to impose degrees of responsibility on social media companies. There have been some who have asked for that, both on the right and the left, interestingly enough, in the United States. But it's not something that's in place currently. Here, of course, in Europe, you've got the Digital Services Act. You do have,
but no companies from that social media field.
No companies
there is no companies from social media.
Oh, that are European, you mean?
European, yeah.
Of course, yes.
They're just United States.
Well, they are, and
that's a
it's not even
question.
clear. It's. I think they are just what they are. They may be transcending. the sovereignty of a particular nation at this point, because they operate so fundamentally at the heart of debate and discourse now. But certainly there are some guardrails in place. It's a question of how effective they would be here in Europe for these large social media companies. But just the amount of data that has to be processed with respect to requests for takedowns, et cetera, it's immense, and it really remains to be seen how cooperative these very large and very powerful social media companies will be to the current regulatory scheme, and whether that regulatory scheme will develop in a way where it will really have an impact.
Because we saw those owners of those companies, big companies, they were, with the President of the United States having good time, dinners, they're cooperating, they're dealing, they're doing big businesses. It's quite odd, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure if it's odd. I think it may be just the way of the world. These are powerful companies that have powerful interests, and I can certainly see that it's important to basically do work with the government, especially a government that flexes its muscles. They did that. I mean, it's not only the current president. They did that with the previous president as well in the United States. But the reality is that there's no easy way to go back. There's no easy way to censor what essentially has been a tidal wave, a tsunami of citizens who have taken to the internet to express themselves. It's a popular movement, but it's a popular movement that also has outside agitators that are really not part of the population. They're not really part of the citizens. They are manipulating that space. And that I think we can do some things about. So I'm not here to tell you, Zoran, that I've got all the answers to journalism, the future of journalism, and how best to address speech on social media as we move forward, and which approach is going to work best. But I like to think that I have a small role here with my information sovereignty approach with respect to those foreign interventions, those foreign manipulations.
But at that point, I have a little remark, a little question. You are aware of Reuters reported about $16 billion earnings of Meta from manipulations, from. Do you know that?
Well, it
should be regulated or not?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there are lots of questions. Should the algorithms be, regulated? The algorithms, of course, historically contribute to the polarization of political discourse to extremes, and of course that has an impact on democracy. And I've written about that elsewhere. But again, these are questions that we as a society are trying to answer as we move from essentially the infancy of the social media age. I think that's how we'll look back at the last 20 years, and into its adolescence, that's going to be fueled by artificial intelligence, which I think will be a game changer. So, the goal here is, what can we do to prevent us from descending into information disorder, that which I described to you earlier, right? The idea that we lose our reference points as to what is accurate, what is defensible. That has an impact even on, that can have an impact, for example, on what can be admitted to evidence in a trial. in a legal trial. If artificial intelligence makes fakery so good, how can you discern what is authentic from what is fabricated? Those issues are, they're not going away. These are issues we're going to have to contend with as a society. And I'm not purporting with my information sovereignty approach to come up with an answer for that. But I am trying to address a very specific problem within that disinformation space, and that is the foreign information and manipulation threat. And that is something I think we can do without alienating people by trying to evaluate content. Because by looking at the foreignness, you're not trying to censor, you're just trying to identify false designation of origin.
Yes. What do you think about Russia or China disinformation agenda? They're trying to influence. I don't know.
So that's the beauty of my approach, Zoran,
Yes.
because I use the Latin phrase res ipsa loquitur.
Okay.
The thing speaks for itself. I don't need to opine as to whether it's Russia or whether it's China or it's some state adjacent or state sponsored intelligence group or troll farm. I'll let the data speak for itself. If, in my approach, we look at everything that comes across the border under false pretenses. It could be from an ally. It could be from an adversary. It could be benign. It could be malign. We look at everything. Now, if it turns out that 90% of everything is coming from one particular country, so be it. And, if that country is Russia or if that country is China, it speaks for itself. I don't have to make a declaration about this country is a problem or this country is a problem. The data will show that country may be a problem.
Yes, but all data has a context. You just can't leave
the context here,
data.
Again, the context here is that we're using known approaches. We know about the architecture of these campaigns. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that it's not going to continue to evolve, but the context is that flow of information across the border. That's the context. And I like the way you describe it as context with text. It's not about the text. It's not about the message. It's about the context. It's about the time, place, or manner of that delivery of the content that matters, not the underlying message. And that should speak for itself. Again, if 90% comes from a particular country, then the people, for example, in Slovenia should know that. And they would know that under this approach.
But the European Union, for example, if we are talking about Russian media, their media are banned. They're not allowed to.
And that's controversial, right?
Yes,
I mean, that's controversial, and not all, I know that not all EU member states view that as favorable. That's one of the reasons precisely I try to not go through the idea of censorship.
Why allow someone who has malign intentions,
Mm-hmm.
malign intentions? Why do you allow them to do that? To harm.
First of all, you're not
consumers.
allowing anything. No one is sitting here saying, "Hey, troll farm, we're going to allow you to come in and pretend to be, an activist in Maribor." No one's allowing these things. That's the misnomer. This is not the mid-20th century with established media companies where people could have a conversation, as would happen in the United States. Hey, could you not cover this in this particular way? Or give us a few weeks to try to sort things out. That type of give and take and negotiation between government or between other leaders in a society, and journalists and media, that's largely gone, right? We don't allow this. We just have to somehow deal with this.
There's a difference, of course, because in Europe we like to regulate. In the United States, you deal with the stuff.
Right. And, censorship, I think, is problematic. I understand that, that there's concerns about propaganda, there's concerns about disinformation, and also Europeans' history is different than the United States' history. We certainly all know that. But I do think that this, to me, seems to be a better approach than flat-out censorship, because it gives you that context. You can see, for some reason, this particular case, you mentioned Russia has been pushing this surreptitiously into our country, has been pushing this particular agenda. That says something. Now, maybe someone will say, just like we said before, I really love this water, or it doesn't bother me that it comes from Russia. Okay, the best I can offer is to give people more and better tools, more effective tools, so that they can make a more informed decision, right?
From a historical perspective, in digital era, we are talking about disinformation and so on, but I don't know, 56 years ago, we faced propaganda. I don't know, Russian Soviet propaganda or Hollywood propaganda. Do you see any difference in this timeline or historical perspective from that perspective?
Well, the difference again is that it's not as linear as it used to be.
Yes.
It's much more chaotic, and I think that
it's troubling for people, for citizenship to orientate in that chaos, we can say, information chaos we are facing.
Yeah, or information disorder in that sense. That's the term that I like to use. But I think, it's not easy to establish order, but I think you can go a long way by at least identifying the source and the false flag operation, if you will, because it says a lot. Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that if a foundation that's owned by a Russian oligarch wants to make a statement in Slovenia and take a position on an issue and disseminate it with clear identification as to who they are, that's fine. I'm not suggesting we should try to flag that. It's when it comes in under false pretenses, right, as part of this influence campaign, when they're pretending to be something or not. That's the disinformative aspect. That's what makes this disinformation, irrespective of whether it's true or false. That is something I think Slovenians should know about.
Before we wrap up,
yes,
because we are running out of time, and that message should be, or what's your final message before we end? How to act responsibly? How to be responsible when facing disinformation in the period of election, before the elections? How to act responsibly as a citizen? What's your advice?
Well, with great freedom comes great responsibility, and I think citizens in Slovenia, like citizens around the world, need to exercise more personal responsibility. I think that means being an educated consumer of information. So maybe you're going to be very careful shopping for that meat or shopping for that particular frozen dish, frozen food at a grocery store, to make sure it has quality ingredients. You should do the same thing with the information you consume, especially before an election, because it may be too late after the election. So the responsibility is great. The freedom is there. We have more freedom than we ever have had before in the information space. But that freedom can be abused. And it's really up to citizens to exercise that responsibility. What my approach does is it gives tools. It makes tools, provides tools that may allow people to better identify and to better assess the information they're consuming. And I think that's important. I think it's important for Slovenia. I think it's important for Europe. And I actually think it's important for democracy.
Michael, thank you for your conversation, for your thoughts, and good luck in your research and advocating democracy.
It's a pleasure to be here, Zoran. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lep pozdrav poslušalci in gledalci. Do naslednjič z vami je bil Zoran Potič. Nasvidenje.